thriving, prosperous Taunton or Bruton or Frome, but it didn't happen because the economics weren't right, and Newport now is hardly more than a speck on the map. So some things don't work, however good the idea may have seemed. The Anglo-Saxons haven't left us much in a material sense. The Normans have left us an enormous amount. Here's the wonderful little-known church at Thirlbere, not far from us here. The largest, earliest aisled church in the west of England. There is no aisled church that early farther west than Thirlbere. An extraordinary place, which must have looked lavish and enormous to those who saw it for the first time. And here, just one example of the dozens or even hundreds of Norman fonts that the county contains. This, perhaps the most splendid of all, at Lullington, up near Frome. Though the Normans weren't conquered as the Anglo-Saxons had been, their thought world and their artistic world gave way to new things, to a style which was more particularly English and less universal or European. And here is perhaps the most extraordinary expression of Somerset in artistic terms. One of the grandest and greatest medieval cathedrals in the world. And in fact, the first cathedral in Europe which was Gothic throughout. Notre Dame in Paris was being built at exactly the same time as the West Front at Wells was going up in the late 1100s. I would have to say that Wells seems to me a much more artistically ambitious work, perhaps not in scale, but in refinement than Notre Dame. We're so familiar with it that we don't see it, but actually this is one of the most extraordinary sites in Europe, both externally and internally. And not just early Gothic, but all the phases of Gothic. This is from the 14th century, looking into the Lady Chapel at the east end of Wells Cathedral, from about 1315 to 1320. A wonderful interplay of space, and liane vaults like palm trees rising up in all directions, and enchanting the gaze, as it were. It's an extraordinary sight. You'd look far and wide, not just in England, but across Europe, for anything as playfully intricate, as wonderfully lucid and beautiful as that space. Next, please. And of course the parishes were doing this as well. Here in Bridgewater, and I'm sorry the slide's not better than it is, Bridgewater should be proud of itself. I looked on Google for a decent picture of St Mary's Church. There isn't one there. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, but it was an interesting experiment to see which of Somerset's grandest sites were adequately represented in visual terms on the internet. St Mary's wasn't. The spire began again in the 14th century, and a very unusual thing in Somerset, a church with a spire. Because in another of the great crises of that time, 1348, a rat scuttles off a ship at Melbourne Regis. The Black Death arrives in the British Isles, and it sweeps northward, cutting a swathe through central Somerset as it makes its way up towards Bristol, wiping out a third to a half of the population, and wiping out as well that sense of there being any point in playfulness or clever interplays of space. There wasn't a time for that anymore. It was time for a broader expression of religious faith built in stone, for something more austere, something plainer in a sense, a quintessential Somerset style, perpendicular, and here seen in its earliest large-scale manifestation in St John's Church at Yeovil from about 1375. But even perpendicular, begun from those origins of catastrophe in the Black Death, was refined into something which became utterly characteristic of Somerset. The Somerset is the perpendicular, the late medieval architectural style county par excellence, and not least in its church towers. It's said that the church towers of Somerset, the late medieval ones, and here is Isle Abbott's, one of the smaller examples, are the finest church towers in Great Britain. And since the church towers of Great Britain are the finest in Europe, and most other places don't have them, I think we can say, by a process of elimination, that the church towers of Somerset are the finest in the world. And church interiors too in this period, the late medieval period. A wonderful tie-beam roof in St Mary's Church. And here, externally, the grandest and greatest, though not the subtlest, of all the church towers of Somerset, the tower of St Mary's Church at Taunton. Reflective of the example of the Tower of Gloucester Cathedral. Remember that Taunton had a population of 5,000 when that tower was created. 5,000 people. How did they do it? Taunton, with a population approaching 100,000, doesn't create anything which is going to last that long in artistic terms, or perhaps even in structural terms. We simply don't aim that high, either physically or metaphorically anymore. We're not capable of it. To put it in simple terms, generally, we can't get our act together to create something like that. But remember that with vision, with a sense of where you're going and what you want to achieve, 5,000 people can do that. Though not without difficulty, because of course Henry VIII, with his difficulties over his divorce, and his son Edward VI, and the Protestant Reformation, decided a break with Rome, and that the idols and the beauty of the churches should be smashed and destroyed. And there, just one small fragment of the destruction from the church at Bishop's Hull. And in the period that followed, another enormous shift in consciousness of the way people looked at the world. Somerset had been loyally Catholic up until the reign of Henry VIII, but within a generation, and with a kind of completeness which is difficult to understand in psychological terms, they rejected all that. They allied themselves to a Protestantism which became increasingly Puritan and militant in its manifestations. No longer did people invest money in churches. No longer was that communal sense of a building which could be created to the glory of God, but also to the glory of people's sense of who they were and their pride in their community. The degree of separation between rich and poor increased dramatically, and the money, where it was invested now in the houses of great men. And here, one of the grandest and greatest of them all, the house of Sir Thomas Phelips at Montacute, built in about 1600. Somerset was never really a county which had a strong and prominent resident nobility. There weren't a lot of lords in Somerset, to put it at its simplest. Here is the grant of a barony to John Paulet, Baron Paulet, in 1627. But he was essentially at the top of the nobility tree in Somerset for a long time. There were a lot of prosperous gentry. There were a lot of prosperous yeomen too, and poor people. But that top strata, that strata which could have, as it were, probably imposed a kind of cohesion on the county, didn't, for the most part, exist, as it did, for example, in a county like Hampshire. And the result was that Somerset became a place of equally weighted towns. And that went all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon period. It also went back to the fact that Taunton didn't rise to cathedral status in 909, because the bishops of Winchester had already nabbed it. Instead, Wells became the cathedral city. And thus, there was a dispersal of that sense of, you know, what was the top of the pyramid in Somerset in geographical terms, also in social terms. It was a place of equally weighted, small to medium-sized towns. And although those towns might have a fierce sense of independence, one from another, they all together, all the populace, had a very strong sense of identification with Somerset itself. And it was in that Tudor period that maps of Somerset, which drew a boundary, maps which you could frame and put on the wall, came into existence, expressive of that sense of identification with a plot of earth